The commanders of all human militaries were trying to figure out exactly which one of the core worlds they were going to take in former Mugen territory. This was a very important decision as the amount of resources going to be put into this operation were absolutely insane, even compared to many of the operations they had before. Once they received additional information from their not-so-human allies, the decision was obvious which one had to be taken. It was a highly prized core world. Highly prized for many different reasons. Not only was it highly prized for the fact that the population made for excellent slaves, not only in the labor department, but also for personal use. This was enough to make many of the humans wonder exactly what type of population this would be, as most slaves are only good for one or the other. To their absolute surprise, this species was very attractive, even by human eyes. Inside the system was a total of 6 gas giants. These were absolutely excellent for mining, as they could easily be harvested and that gas could easily be condensed and sold off. The sector also had a standard yellow dwarf star, very similar to that one found in the Sol sector, which meant that the calculations for the jump were going to be a lot easier. And also the area in that sector was very easy to traverse. Along with everything else, there was 11 space stations. These were not strictly just for mining, but they were also used for trade. This sector turned out to be a major trade route. Originally, it was just a center of trade for the faction itself, and that was all. But now it was a major trade route between the Queshvart faction and the Deshnevert faction. The system, because of this, was highly defended, and this cannot be understated. Taking the system, though it would disrupt all the factions' war efforts by severing their main supply line, was no simple depot. The main reason is they have found that 6 out of the 11 spaceports had been refitted as shipyards. Along with that, they didn't know what else had been done. Because it was such a valuable target, they knew it would be well defended. This is why not only the first, but the third fleets were completely mobilized. Along with that, every single orbital drop/invasion ship from the second fleet was also allocated. The Allied fleet was allocated in total, and of course, they were itching for a fight. The hospital and medical fleets were all put on standby, along with the recovery fleet, as they would be waiting in reserve. The civilian fleet were not going to be told exactly about this operation, just in case, yet they knew they would assemble very, very quickly. One of the alien cruiser commanders was asked by one of the other human captains, "Is this enough?" He simply responded, "What, you want more?" The human simply turned and hinted about a little bit of assistance that might be coming to help them along the way. Due to the massive movements, the large numbers of ships that were going to be moving into position, there was no way to hide the operation, not fully. The enemy was going to know something was coming. For some reason, all the fleets were on the move. All they could do was guess where the attack was coming. The strike happened at around 0200 planet capital local time. This was designed specifically to fight right into their sleep cycle and make sure it was difficult for them to organize themselves. The first thing the enemy had registered was the Allied fleet. The Allied fleet was warping in. The enemy didn't scramble too much as they saw the number of ships coming and they realized it was just not going to be enough to take the sector. The enemy scrambled his home fleet. All others simply stood by and watched as they believed the home fleet would be more than enough to handle this. The enemy ships actually had in the sector 2 Titan-class command ships, 29 battleships, 63 cruisers, and over 2,500 of mix of destroyers, frigates, and corvettes. And of course, this didn't even include the home fleet, which was by itself almost 1,500 ships. The Allied fleet came out of warp outside of the sector, which is standard practice, and began to power its weapons immediately. They hailed the enemy fleet, and the response they got was not even an introduction to the one speaking. They simply said, "It is wise of you to surrender. We are such better masters than those hairless bipeds." The friendly fleet simply stated back, "We didn't come here to surrender. We've come to take our home back." On the other side, the enemy chuckled at this, though apparently some of the commanders were smarter than they looked, as they began to move their ships away from the dockyards as fast as they could. The response from the enemy was, "You are truly fools. We have an entire war fleet at our backs, and even with these upgraded ships that I see, you can't take us all. We have a fleet, multiple fleets to support us." The commander of the Allied fleet simply responded, "Wish we had thought of that." Sensors all of a sudden started going nuts as human ships started blinking in from multiple vectors. "Oh, wait, we did," he said. The human voice came over in that same mechanical tone that they always use. "This is Admiral Nimitz of the Combined Earth Fleets. Stand down and surrender, and we can promise you safe passage back to your homeworlds. This message is to more than those in command, but all those in bondage as well." Seeing the fleets come in, the enemy fleet was in full mobilization as they tried to break free from their moorings as fast as they could. They didn't want to be caught inside or behind the stations. They knew what would happen if one of those things blows, and you don't want to be anywhere near it. "You are the ones that should surrender. We will never yield to inferiors like yourselves." "Your funeral." With that, the enemy fleets began to organize and advance as the human fleets continued to blink in and getting formation. Sensors were picking up warp signatures coming in from faction territory. The enemy vessels would arrive within 10 to 30 minutes, depending on how close the next sector was. They needed to get this party underway. The sensors also picked up another signal. It was too large to be a fleet. The enemy started to wonder if their sensors were malfunctioning, as suddenly a burst of power came out. A massive ship, larger than their largest space dock, shows up on their sensors. The burst of neutrons that happens when every jump comes out freaked the hell out of the enemy. What was even worse is within a few moments, small bursts of power showed the fleet that was there to support it, showing up and then surrounding this large ship. The human Dreadnought, the HSF Gilgamesh, came from Earth, its own home fleet, one of only a handful of dreadnoughts ever made, along with the core world's defense fleet at its back. With that, they were given no words and began to spin up their main guns. They joined in with the other battleships, but the Dreadnought had much more than just the one main gun. No, it had two separate batteries with three main guns apiece, and they targeted the enemy fleet. Before they could fire, though, they received a surprise. 6 of the space stations rotated and then fired a main gun-sized weapon at the human fleet. The human fleet began to fire their main guns as well. As a result, the energies warped up near each other and altered their trajectories, in some cases spiraling the actual beams in a helix formation, and others would simply refract sideways. In one case, the beams actually struck each other, and there was a strange, odd burst of colors. No one had time to actually analyze this, as it was time for this party to really kick off. And of course, the humans brought the party favors. With all this confusion, 60% of the main guns missed their targets, although they would usually hit something else, as there was everything throughout space. The fleets advance as the main guns all continue to fire, not only from the space stations, but from the human battleships as well. The kicker is, the enemy had learned. Human battleships have 2 volleys. As the enemy realized that they needed to get close, They needed to get close so that the main gun could not actually strike them. As the second volley went out, the enemy fleet, most of it, went to warp. The resulting warp put the enemy within tertiary range. The miscommunications and miscalculations, and of course, the disturbance in space by so much gravimetric interference, would sometimes cause them to go off course, and then two ships would slam into each other at speeds at 1.1 to 1.3 the speed of light, resulting in both vessels being tore up. If it was one of them catching directly on the bow, the ship would simply ripple and explode from the amount of mass condensing like a nuclear weapon. Turrets immediately on both sides began to swing wildly, trying desperately to fire onto the enemy before they took that first hit, and neither side would underestimate the first hit. Torpedoes and missiles were fired at basically point-blank range, and they filled up the space as their chemical rockets burned through and sent all sorts of trails of whatever was being burned off through the air. Chaff was everywhere as both sides wanted desperately to stop the rounds from impacting on each other. Drones were launched in wave after wave after wave. One frigate would simply open up all sides, and you would just see the drones ripping out as though somebody was firing a belt of ammunition. They entered space and began to rain all sorts of holy hell on whatever type of enemy they could lock onto. The issue is there was so much going on that they had trouble locking on and sometimes fell under the enemy guns because of this. All this going on as main guns continued to fire through space. Both sides were having losses mount. The Allied fleet, surprisingly, was getting away almost untouched. They were not directly targeted by the main guns, and they drove straight towards the home fleet and started to tear them apart. With their upgraded weapons, they were able to outrange their faction counterparts, and this gave them an advantage they were going to take full advantage of. They began to dive in, going into secondary and then tertiary range, but by the time they got to point defense cannon range, it was already over, and the home fleet was just a drift of hulking masses of twisted metal. The Dreadnought continued to fire. It has 12 shots in total before it has to cool down, and time is going to be needed for that. A long time. It takes out a few of the station and cripples another one, and even manages to reach out and tag the side of one of the command buckets, which is just a slang term for the Titan-class ship that usually the command crew, the royalty, the empires, empresses, and whatever the hell they want to call each other. At this moment, humanity just calls them a target. The stations that were there fired their 2 shots and then continued to fire. One started glowing as the systems began to melt its components as it fired its 3rd shot. Another one simply exploded as the power core overloaded, melted down from the strain. Battleships on both sides taking the brunt of these attacks. There's such large targets that they cannot move out of the way. Even though it takes a few seconds for the beam to reach out that far, it was still not enough time for them to move their ship away, and they would get hit. This was also more dangerous as they were getting within tertiary range of others, and you can't dodge a mid-range shot. You might as well just be point-blank range with a shotgun. To this end, the human destroyers became the best ships to be in as they can duck and dive all they need to avoid the shots. Not to mention, they are from bow to stern, ventral to dorsal, nothing but engines and guns. And when you're in a furball like this is exactly what you need. The cruisers are able to dodge a little better than the battleships. However, their armor is being put to an absolute test as they're still taking hits that force the ship to shake violently from side to side. Eventually, the home fleet, after being destroyed, is just floating in space and able to deflect some of the shots coming from what was left of the station. The Allied fleets began to get close and target the station themselves. They were told specifically to try and spare the shipyards, if possible, as any type of resource they can get is going to be definitely worth it. Another station tries to fire and explodes as they approach, due to a simple meltdown. The Allied fleet, unfortunately, was caught in the explosion. They were unable to continue as the energy burst had damaged their systems and they would need time to reset, reboot, and of course, cool down the ships themselves, as the burst of thermal activity had run right up against the hulls. Being stuck in a purely defensive position was not a good idea as more enemy ships continued to warp in. The Dreadnought, being able to shake off most of what was hitting it, was moving at flank speed in an attempt to cover them, using its retractable turrets, which made the enemy think that this ship can't do anything once it fires its main guns. We can take it out later. Big mistake. It used these turrets to engage the new enemies, and with incredible precision was taking them apart piecemeal. The third and first fleets were finally able to break through the enemy. The enemy had pulled back to consolidate around the planet, and as the human fleets approached from three different sides, they asked the rest of the fleets to stand down and surrender, which of course they didn't. Now the first, third, and home fleets were free to go in and raise all sorts of holy havoc. It seemed as though they didn't even care about the damage, as some of the ships were clearly damaged to the point where they shouldn't even be thinking about joining a battle, and their alien allies kept telling them to stand down. They'll take their place, don't go in. But it seemed like the humans didn't care. It seemed as though their programming had got them focused so much on the mission that they would not stop. The defense satellites came alive and became the biggest issue to the humans. They would spit out an impressive amount of torpedoes and cannon fire, so much so that they were the primary target to take out within a few moments. Surprising everybody, they also had point defense turrets, which made drone attacks almost impossible to be successful. This made everyone realize that their enemy was definitely not stupid. Many of the alien ships and satellites ended up burning down through the atmosphere under the combined assaults of human and allied forces. And now, space around this planet belongs to humanity and its allies. Humanity calls down again the Admiral, asking as nicely as he can to stand down before humanity takes their dreadnought and shoves it up their ass sideways. The response they got was simple. All you'll find down here is your death. We have had many solar rotations to prepare. This is going to be nothing for you here but a human burial ground. After hearing that, knowing what it truly meant as they had studied the aliens' culture and language, the Admiral simply turned and said, Invasion fleet, did you copy last? The invasion fleet was moving closer than lunar orbit. Roger, we copy last. The Admiral sent the next message. Task Force Murphy, you are clear to engage. Response, yes, sir. On the video of defiance of the Planetary governor, they paused it and they emphasized what was in the back. They looked and they could see the young, the sick, and the broken slaves behind them. Everybody knew they were going to be used, these young ones, these sick ones, these ones that couldn't defend themselves, as meat shields. One of the captains turned, Comms, send this image to the rest of the fleet and tell them we go in 20 minutes. The image was sent to all the personnel, and they all got ready. They all got their preparations, and they all could hear it whispered around the fleet. One more. Just one more. In orbit, the drop went exactly by the numbers. Though once they enter the atmosphere, you would think they're trying to invade Earth with the amount of ground fire and aircraft that's swooping around. Thankfully, the decoys, the chaff, the flares, and everything else had done its job, and most of the troopers actually reached the ground without getting blasted. The troopers would catch fire the moment their pods hit the ground. Many of those sitting in that city had already learned to strike at the pods, take them out before the humans get out, and they needed to stop them as soon as possible because what was becoming behind them was so much worse. The troopers knew that the corvettes were already on the way and they could not be static. They could not just set up a defense line and started pushing with unholy abandon. Their violence of action scared the living shit out of everybody that was there. These faceless bipeds that seemed to jump up and shrug off weapons fire. They were using heavy weapons and armor. It seemed as though it was almost impossible to even slow them down, let alone stop them. Every once in a while, you would see a human be struck, and they would go flying backwards, and there would be a cheer from those on the enemy side. But that cheer would not last long, as 2 or 3 humans would take their place, and then to their horror, the human would simply get back up and keep coming at them. Several corvettes that were coming down with resupply were forced to crash. Others landed but were unable to take off due to too much damage. They did their job. Heavy weapons and armor began to flow out of them, and the battle turned into a slog as the enemy began to reposition to face the new human advance. They knew that with every landing there was going to be more armor, more weapons, and they needed to face it. The battle lines were set up hastily, and they didn't have time to reinforce. The city itself began to crumble under the assault and, of course, the defenses. They would try to set up traps by lobbing explosives into other buildings. They had no problem toppling a building if it meant it would land on even one of the humans. Dropping a skyscraper to get one man seems a little odd, but when you're about to get your ass kicked, well, you'll do anything. They would immediately run, blow up infrastructure in order to slow down any of the humans. This included bridges and any type of overpass, any type of transportation that made it easy for them to get there. To their absolute shock, the humans would simply get a running start, seemingly jump, and they would see some sort of torch come out on either side of them. These jump packs made any attempts to stop their infantry a mild inconvenience at best. It did slow down the armor, just not for very long. Before too long, the cities quite literally ran red with the blood and parts of enemies. 4 days of fighting it took. 4 days of non-stop intense fighting and ended the Battle of the Sector. The final battle was deep inside a bunker which held the command group down there. The planetary governor, the empress, or whatever the hell you want to call it, were all sitting there shaking, holding their weapons aimed at the door as the door was beaten down as several armored bipeds crashed into it over and over again, and eventually it gave way, falling down on one of their own, and then they simply stood up, ran onto the door as though it was a ramp. One of them stopped halfway, looked down on one of the aliens that was stuck underneath the door, and seemed to utter something in its own language, but no one could understand when it said, "Excuse me." Those in charge decided that they would fight to the end, and end they did. Those bipeds in armor simply ran in and seemed to shrug off all the hits from their small weapons as though they weren't even being struck. Some of them walked up and simply pulled the weapons out of their hands, but then they saw other suits that weren't bipedal. What the hell were these? Some were bipedal, but they didn't have the same shape. Was this a new type of robot the humans had? And then they saw this thing reach up. That looks like the claw of a... That was the last thing the planetary leader thought, as that claw went right through his skull, into his torso, and ripped clean through the body, leaving his entrails to drip on the ground. The slaves, huddled off in a corner, were absolutely petrified as these mechanical monsters simply walked up to them. They thought for sure they would face the same fate, and then, their absolute surprise, these monsters reached down, grabbed the chains, and broke them, seemingly with their bare hands. Then they looked over to others with these thick metal collars around their necks or around their torso, and with a screech of metal, they snapped clean, and the collars were gone. They didn't understand and were just amazed at what was happening. A few hours later, a drop soldier was sitting there, shaking, his head draped almost in between all 4 of his legs as he just shook there, not moving. Another one walks up and To the blind eye, one would think that the shaking one was a malfunctioning robot and the other one was a statue, as you couldn't hear anything outside of the suit. Inside the suit, however, was a little different. A human voice said, "First drop?" There was no answer as the shaking one seemed to start getting a hold of itself a little more. "I would say you get used to it, but yeah." The other one opens up its helmet, leans forward, and begins to expel all of the food it had consumed in the last 48 hours. After that, it pulled its helmet back down and mechanically, as he had been trained, sealed its helmet to make sure it was good. "Feel better now?" The alien trooper simply nodded. "Good. Now get up. We still have work to do." The alien drop soldier wondered if these humans were actually organic. He fought alongside them, but he was completely exhausted in a couple hours, yet for days they didn't stop. They just kept going. Even after taking hits hard enough that would turn his insides into his outsides or vaporize him, they just would get back up as though nothing had happened. They were so mechanically efficient as they whipped their weapons around, firing shots never seeming to miss at all. They were extremely brutal killers as they got close, they would forgo the ballistic ammunition and take out the enemies with blades. It was horrifying to see, as many of the enemies were still splattered across their own shells. Completely unwavering in their focus, they continued to move their way up, not stopping to enjoy their kill, not stopping to yell out in vengeance every time one of their own stopped breathing. No, they just kept going. Towards the end of this thought, he got up and walked over to his human associate. At this time, he could see his bipedal brethren using the arm of his metal suit to raise part of a fallen building and waving him over. He ran over and looked underneath, and sure enough, there was a bunch of slaves down there. Most of them were emaciated and looked like hell. They were pinned down by the debris, but they were definitely still alive. He reached down to help them out of the hole, but most of them were hesitant to do so. That is, until he reached down with one of his arms and simply held it out, and eventually one of them reached out. He squeezed the hand, not enough to hurt them, and helped them out of the hole, and then reached up, grabbed the collar around them, and snapped it off. A human thing. He remembered this was always what the humans did to make sure that those they were liberating were not afraid of them, and it seemed to work. As the one was reaching up where the collar used to be and started rubbing on it, he had this look of complete elation, like what was going on? But wait a minute, am I free again? What was going on? This is amazing. And with that, it didn't take long to get the rest out of the hole itself. The human looked them over, picked up the smallest child, who was only able to crawl at this point, and an injured man whose leg was too mangled to actually walk, and he continued on. He carried them both, the former slaves, to a rally point where they could receive care. The humans had already brought down their frigates, had set up their medical tents, and they were starting to save as many lives as possible. It was insane. After dropping them off, both of them turned around and they began to collect others. Over a dozen drops were completed. They brought so many in. Many of them were just following these two suits as they were waved over, and then were amazed to find their own brethren, their own family still alive, being taken care of, being fed, being given water, medical care, and even put in new mobile buildings. They didn't know what was going on. He thought to himself, wait a minute, they call that, what do they call that? Ah, yes, a tent. They call it a tent. The alien trooper stopped after he put another one on the ground that immediately ran to its family and could see that they were actually getting in the tent and there was actually smiles on the ground. He put those two and they took off. He paused to look at so many that were in pain, so many that had bruises around where the collars were. Many of them had lacerations where they had been struck. Others had broken bones that were being mended by human technology at this point. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Such horror was in front of him. His human partner reached out and grabbed his arm and pulled it hard to get his attention. The alien trooper turned around and was face to face with the human's faceless helmet. He thought for a moment the first time he saw one of these and thought for sure that they couldn't be alive. This had to be a robot. And now he wonders what's going on. In his helmet, he heard his partner said, "One more. Help me get one more." The alien trooper repeated, "One more." And they turned and walked away, heading out to get more survivors. Yet the whole time, the alien trooper was always wondering as he looked at his brethren, thinking, is this human or machine? 5 days later, after everything had settled down and the recovery groups were starting to get some of the infrastructure built again, many of the bridges would have to be rebuilt. Most of the cities were completely trashed, and they would have to do something about the agriculture. Yet the medical fleets were there to help everybody get strong enough that they could actually continue their own work and rebuild their own culture. 5 days later, they received the message. A message that arrived from human space, a message that was sent all over the fleet, to every single ship and to every single helmet. Everyone received it. And this message made every single human's heart drop right out their ass.